The morning sun painted gentle shadows across John Harris's modest kitchen in Winstead, Connecticut, as he performed his daily ritual of preparing breakfast, not just for himself, but for his beloved companion, Milo. The orange tabby cat sat patiently by his food bowl, his tail curled perfectly around his paws, watching John's every move with those intelligent golden eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of ages. "Just a moment, buddy," John smiled, reaching for the premium cat food he always kept stocked. The sound of the tin opening made Milo's ears perk up, his whiskers twitching with anticipation. It was these small, quiet moments that made John's life complete, though anyone looking in from the outside might find it peculiarly simple. At 35, John had built a life that most would consider unremarkable. His position as a senior accountant at Millbridge Financial Services provided him with stability and respect within the community, but it was hardly the stuff of excitement. His desk, adorned with precisely arranged calculators and a single framed photo of Milo, told the story of a man who found comfort in order and routine. The relationships he fostered with his clients went beyond mere professional courtesy. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the local bakery, always greeted him with a warm smile and often slipped him an extra muffin for being such a dear. Mr. Patterson, the hardware store owner, regularly sought John's advice not just on financial matters, but on life in general. In his own quiet way, John had become woven into the fabric of Winstead's community. But it was his relationship with Milo that truly defined his life. The cat had appeared on his doorstep 6 years ago, a tiny kitten with matted fur and uncertain steps. John hadn't planned on having a pet, but something in those golden eyes spoke to him. Perhaps it was the reflection of his own solitude, or maybe it was simply fate disguised as chance. Their evening routine was as sacred as their mornings. John would settle into his favorite armchair with a book, and Milo would claim his rightful place on John's lap. The cat's purring would blend with the ticking of the old grandfather clock, creating a symphony of contentment that filled their small house. During thunderstorms, Milo would press closer, and John would scratch behind his ears, providing reassurance that they were safe together. At the office, John's colleagues often teased him about his attachment to his cat. "When are you going to find yourself a real family, John?" they'd ask, not understanding that for him, family wasn't defined by traditional boundaries. Milo was more than enough. The cat seemed to understand John in ways that humans never quite managed to. Each night, as John prepared for bed, Milo would perform his own ritual, a careful inspection of the house, patting from window to window, before finally settling at the foot of John's bed. It was as if the cat had appointed himself guardian of their peaceful existence, a role he took as seriously as John took his responsibilities at the bank. Life had fallen into such a comfortable pattern that John barely noticed the growing signs of the approaching autumn. The leaves were beginning to turn, and the air carried that distinct crispness that New England autumns were famous for. Weather reports mentioned increased rainfall, but in the comfort of their routine, neither John nor Milo paid much attention to these early warnings. Looking back, John would later realize that he had taken their quiet life for granted. The simple joy of Milo greeting him at the door each evening, the gentle weight of the cat on his chest in the morning, the soft patting of paws following him from room to room. All of it seemed as permanent as the hills that surrounded their small town. But life has a way of disrupting even the most established patterns, and the storms that were gathering on the horizon would soon test the bounds of their inseparable bond in ways that neither man nor cat could have anticipated. If this story has caught your interest, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give us a like. Let us know which city you're watching from. Let's continue. The October sky over Winstead had been growing increasingly temperamental, like a moody teenager testing boundaries. John watched through his office window as dark clouds gathered overhead, their ominous shapes reflecting in the polished surface of his desk. The weather forecasts had become more insistent in their warnings, but like most locals, John had grown accustomed to Connecticut's seasonal mood swings. At Millbridge Financial Services, the day proceeded as usual, though with an underlying current of unease. Mrs. Henderson had stopped by earlier, concern etched on her face as she discussed how the recent weather had affected her bakery's deliveries. John listened attentively, offering both financial advice and emotional support, as was his way. "You're an angel, John," she said, placing a paper bag on his desk. "Extra blueberry muffins today. Milo's favorite, right? The way you talk about that cat, he must have quite the refined palate." Her attempt at humor did little to mask her worry about the gathering storm. During his lunch break, John received an unusual number of messages from concerned clients. The local weather service had upgraded their advisory to a severe storm warning, but John had weathered plenty of storms in his 15 years in Winstead. Still, something about this one felt different. The air held a strange electricity, and even the usually stoic Mr. Patterson had called to reschedule his appointment, mentioning something about securing his storage units. At home that evening, Milo seemed more restless than usual. The cat paced between windows, his tail twitching with nervous energy. John noticed how his faithful companion's ears would flatten slightly at each distant rumble of thunder, a behavior he'd never exhibited before. Instead of settling into their usual evening routine, Milo kept returning to the window, pressing his paw against the glass as if trying to warn John of something only he could sense. "What's got you so worked up, buddy?" John asked, attempting to coax Milo into their familiar evening cuddle. The cat came to him briefly but remained alert, his golden eyes fixed on the darkening sky outside. The wind had begun to pick up, making the old maple tree in the front yard sway ominously. As John prepared for bed that night, he took extra precautions. He checked the emergency kit he kept in the basement, made sure his phone was fully charged, and filled several containers with fresh water, just in case. The weather service had mentioned possible flooding in low-lying areas, though their house had always stayed dry during previous storms. Milo followed him through each of these preparations, staying unusually close. When John finally settled into bed, instead of taking his usual place at the foot, Milo curled up right next to John's pillow. His presence was both comforting and concerning. In 6 years together, the cat had never deviated from his preferred sleeping spot. The wind continued to grow stronger, and rain began to fall in heavy sheets against the windows. John found himself struggling to sleep, distracted by both the storm's intensity and Milo's unusual behavior. He reached out to stroke the cat's fur, feeling the slight tremors running through his small body. "It's okay, buddy," he whispered into the darkness. "We've been through storms before. This one's no different." But even as he spoke the words, a part of him wondered if he was trying to convince Milo or himself. The cat's only response was to press closer, his purring barely audible over the increasingly violent weather. In the early hours of the morning, John was awakened by a sound he'd never heard before, a deep, resonant groaning that seemed to come from the very earth itself. Milo was already awake, standing at the bedroom door, his tail puffed up to twice its normal size. The rain had become a constant roar, and through his window, John could see that the street lights were creating eerie reflections on what appeared to be rapidly rising water. Little did John know that this night would mark the end of the life he had so carefully constructed. The comfortable routines, the predictable patterns, the quiet evenings with Milo. All of it was about to be swept away by forces beyond his control. As he got up to investigate the strange sounds and rising water, he had no way of knowing that the next few hours would test not only his resilience, but also the profound bond between a man and his beloved cat in ways he could never have imagined. The transformation of Winstead happened with frightening speed. What began as an unusually heavy rainfall quickly evolved into something far more menacing. John stood at his living room window, watching in disbelief as the familiar streets of his neighborhood disappeared beneath a rapidly rising tide of muddy water. The police scanner app on his phone crackled with increasingly urgent communications. All units were initiating immediate evacuation procedures for zones of through D. The dispatcher's voice remained professional, but carried an unmistakable edge of urgency. John's stomach tightened as he realized his street fell within Zone B. The comfortable reality he had known just hours ago was literally washing away before his eyes. Milo's behavior had grown increasingly agitated. The normally composed cat darted between windows, letting out low, guttural sounds that John had never heard him make before. When the emergency alert blared from John's phone, Milo jumped so violently that he knocked over a ceramic vase, sending it crashing to the floor. Emergency alert. Immediate evacuation required. All residents in Zones AD must evacuate immediately. This is not a drill. The message on his phone screen glowed with alarming intensity in the dim light. Outside, emergency vehicle sirens began to pierce through the constant drumming of rain and wind. John's training in crisis management at Millbridge Financial kicked in, helping him maintain some semblance of calm as he began gathering essential items. "Come on, Milo, we need to get ready," John called out, his voice steady despite the chaos unfolding around them. He retrieved Milo's carrier from the hall closet, but the cat had vanished from sight. "Milo!" The silence that answered him was deafening. The sound of breaking glass from somewhere downstairs sent John rushing toward the basement steps. Water was already seeping in through the foundation, creating small rivulets that snaked across the concrete floor. The emergency kit he had checked just hours ago now sat in a growing puddle. As John hastily grabbed the kit, a loud crash from upstairs sent his heart racing. He bounded back up the steps to find Milo perched precariously on the kitchen counter, his golden eyes wide with fear. Through the broken window behind him, John could see debris floating past, branches, trash cans, and items he couldn't identify in the darkness. "It's okay, buddy," John said softly, approaching the counter with the carrier. "We need to go now." But as he reached for Milo, a deafening crack of thunder shook the house. The lights flickered once, twice, and then plunged them into darkness. In that moment of confusion, Milo bolted. John's heart nearly stopped as he watched his beloved cat leap through the broken window. "Milo!" he screamed, rushing to the window. Through the curtain of rain, he could just make out Milo's form as the cat darted across their waterlogged yard toward the large maple tree. Without hesitation, John dropped the carrier and ran for the front door. The water had risen significantly in just the few minutes since he'd last checked, now reaching halfway up his calves as he splashed through what had once been his front yard. The cold shocked his system, but he pressed forward, calling Milo's name against the wind. The beam from his phone's flashlight caught glimpses of orange fur among the tree's branches. Milo had climbed higher than John had ever seen him go before, seemingly driven by some primal instinct to seek higher ground. As John approached the tree, he could hear the wood creaking ominously under the assault of wind and water. "Please, Milo, come down," John pleaded, his clothes now completely soaked. The water continued to rise around his legs, and in the distance, he could hear the megaphones of emergency vehicles announcing evacuation orders. Time was running out, but the thought of leaving without Milo was unbearable. The rain intensified, making it almost impossible to keep his eyes open as he searched the branches for any sign of his friend. The powerful beams of emergency vehicles now swept across the neighborhood, creating surreal shadows that danced through the trees. Each passing minute brought new sounds of destruction: the groaning of stressed wood, the crash of falling branches, and the constant rush of water that seemed to be swallowing their world whole. In that moment, as John stood reaching toward the branches where he'd last seen Milo, he faced a choice that would haunt him for months to come. The decision he would make in the next few minutes would set in motion a chain of events that would test not only his resilience, but also his understanding of love, loss, and the unexpected ways life can bring healing even in the darkest moments. The emergency responders found John still calling for Milo, his voice now hoarse and barely audible above the storm. Two firefighters in bright yellow gear waded through the waist-deep water toward him, their powerful flashlights cutting through the darkness. "Sir, you need to evacuate immediately." The urgency in the firefighter's voice left no room for argument. "The structural integrity of these buildings is compromised. We can't guarantee anyone's safety if you stay." John barely registered their words, his eyes fixed on the maple tree where he'd last glimpsed Milo. The cat had disappeared into the dense foliage, and no amount of calling seemed to draw him out. The tree swayed dangerously in the wind, its branches creaking under the strain. "My cat," John tried to explain, his words catching in his throat. "He's up there. I can't leave him." The desperation in his voice was palpable, but the firefighters exchanged knowing looks. They'd seen this scenario play out before. Pet owners refusing to leave without their beloved animals. "Sir, animals have amazing survival instincts," the second firefighter said, placing a firm hand on John's shoulder. "Quietos especiali. They know how to find safe ground. But you need to come with us now, or we'll have to forcibly remove you." The reality of the situation finally began to sink in. The water had risen another few inches just in the time they'd been talking. Various objects floated past them: garden furniture, trash cans, and even what looked like someone's mailbox. The wind howled through the trees with increasing ferocity, and in the distance, John could hear the ominous sound of emergency sirens growing more urgent. With his heart feeling like it was being torn in two, John allowed the firefighters to guide him toward their vehicle. Every step away from the maple tree felt like a betrayal. He kept looking back, hoping to catch one last glimpse of Milo, but the darkness and rain had transformed his familiar neighborhood into an alien landscape. The evacuation center had been set up in the Winstead High School gymnasium. As John sat on one of the cots provided for evacuees, wrapped in a scratchy emergency blanket, he felt numb. Around him, other residents of Zones through D huddled in small groups, sharing stories and offering comfort to one another. Mrs. Henderson from the bakery spotted him and hurried over, her usual cheerful demeanor replaced by concern. "Oh, John," she said, sitting beside him. "I'm so sorry about Milo, but you have to believe he'll be okay. Cats are survivors." She placed a gentle hand on his arm, but John barely felt it. His mind was still back at his house, replaying those final moments over and over, wondering what he could have done differently. The night stretched on endlessly. John's phone had long since run out of battery, and the emergency radio broadcasts provided little comfort. The storm continued to rage outside, and with each passing hour, the chances of finding Milo seemed to diminish. As dawn broke, the rain finally began to ease, but the damage was already done. Emergency management officials moved through the gymnasium, updating evacuees on the situation. Parts of Winstead had been transformed beyond recognition. Houses were flooded, roads were washed out, and entire neighborhoods were temporarily inaccessible. When they finally allowed residents to return briefly to gather essential items, John's heart sank. His street was among those deemed too dangerous for immediate return. The officials spoke of structural assessments, safety protocols, and temporary housing arrangements, but John heard it all as if through a fog. Mr. Patterson, who had been helping coordinate local relief efforts, approached John with an offer. "My sister runs a small apartment complex in Portland, Maine," he said. "She has a vacant unit. It's not much, but it's yours if you want it. Maybe a fresh start would help." John stared at the emergency shelter wall, where photos of the damage were being posted. His neighborhood was virtually unrecognizable in the aerial shots. Somewhere in that chaos was Milo. If he had, John couldn't complete the thought. The idea of leaving seemed impossible, but staying and being unable to search properly was equally unbearable. The decision to accept Mr. Patterson's offer felt like another betrayal, but John knew he needed to be practical. He had to maintain his job, even remotely, and he couldn't stay in the emergency shelter indefinitely. As he filled out the paperwork for temporary relocation, each signature felt like another step away from Milo. What John didn't know then was that this forced separation was just the beginning of a journey that would test his faith, challenge his understanding of connection, and ultimately lead him down a path he never expected. The universe, it seemed, had plans that extended far beyond the comfortable life he'd built in Winstead, plans that would eventually bring healing in the most unexpected ways. Portland, Maine greeted John with a crisp November breeze and the salty scent of the Atlantic. His new apartment, though modest, offered a view of the harbor that would have been breathtaking under different circumstances. But for John, every sunrise over the water only reminded him of mornings spent with Milo, and each seagull's cry seemed to echo the absence of his friend's familiar meow. The transition to remote work had been surprisingly smooth. Numbers were numbers, whether in Connecticut or Maine, but adapting to his new life proved far more challenging. Every morning, he still instinctively reached down to fill a food bowl that wasn't there. At night, The absence of warm fur against his legs left an emptiness that seemed to grow rather than diminish with time. "You need to get out more," his colleague Sarah advised during their weekly video call. "Portland's a beautiful city, John. You can't spend every weekend driving back to Winstead." She was right, of course. His weekend searches of his old neighborhood had yielded nothing but disappointment and growing concern from the local authorities about his presence in the still-recovering area. One particularly difficult evening, after another fruitless trip to Winstead, John found himself walking along Portland's eastern promenade. The path was busy with joggers and dog walkers enjoying the sunset, their contentment a stark contrast to his own restlessness. As he passed a community bulletin board, a bright orange flyer caught his eye. "Portland Animal Haven, volunteers needed." John stood staring at the flyer, memories washing over him like the waves breaking against the shore below. He remembered how Milo had first appeared in his life, a scared, hungry kitten who needed help. Perhaps he could honor that memory by helping other animals in need. The next morning, instead of his usual remote work routine, John found himself standing outside a converted warehouse in Portland's East Bayside neighborhood. The building's exterior had been painted with cheerful murals of animals, but it was the sounds coming from inside that made his heart catch. The familiar symphony of meows, barks, and gentle human voices. "You must be John," a woman in her 50s greeted him warmly. "I'm Linda, the shelter director. Thank you for reaching out." She had kind eyes and a calm demeanor that immediately put him at ease. As she led him through the facility, John noticed how every cage and kennel was spotlessly clean, despite the shelter's obvious budget constraints. "We're always short-handed," Linda explained, showing him the cat room. "Especially for our special cases, the ones who need a little extra patience and understanding." She paused beside a cage where a black cat sat huddled in the corner, barely visible. "This is Shadow. He came to us after a house fire. He's having trouble trusting humans again." John felt something stir inside him as he watched the frightened cat. He understood that fear, that sense of loss and displacement. Without thinking, he sat down on the floor near Shadow's cage, not making eye contact, just being present. Linda watched with approval. "You've done this before," she observed quietly. "I had a cat," John replied, his voice thick with emotion. As he told Linda about Milo and the flood, she listened without interruption, her expression full of understanding. When he finished, she placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes," she said softly, "the best way to heal a broken heart is to help heal someone else's." She gestured around the room. "These animals have all lost something too. Homes, trust, love. They need people who understand that kind of loss." Over the next few weeks, John fell into a new routine. His mornings still belonged to Millbridge Financial, but his evenings and weekends were spent at Portland Animal Haven. He learned the stories of each resident, the abandoned, the lost, the frightened, and found himself drawing on his own experience with Milo to connect with them. Shadow, the black cat, slowly began to emerge from his corner when John was around. Other volunteers noticed how the most traumatized animals seemed to respond to his quiet patience. John discovered that while he couldn't heal the hole in his own heart, he could at least help these animals find their way to new beginnings. What he didn't realize was that his own path to healing was just beginning to unfold. The universe had set in motion events that would challenge everything he thought he knew about loss, hope, and the mysterious ways that love could transcend distance and time. As autumn deepened into winter, Portland Animal Haven would become more than just a volunteer position. It would become the setting for a miracle that no one could have anticipated. December painted Portland in shades of white and gray. But inside Portland Animal Haven, life bustled with color and warmth. John had become an integral part of the shelter's daily operations, his natural affinity for organization and numbers proving as valuable as his gentle way with the animals. The shelter's booking system had never been more efficient, and Linda often joked that they'd struck gold when he walked through their door. "You've got the magic touch," Linda remarked one evening, watching as John coaxed a particularly skittish Persian cat to eat. The cat, nicknamed Princess by the staff, had refused food for days after arriving at the shelter. "They sense something in you, John, something that tells them they're safe." John knew what it was. The animals could sense his own loss, his own understanding of displacement. Every scratched ear, every gentle word, every patient moment spent sitting quietly beside a frightened animal carried the weight of his memories of Milo. He'd stopped making those weekend trips to Winstead, but he never stopped hoping. One snowy afternoon, as John updated the shelter's records, Linda burst into the office with unusual excitement. "John, you need to see this." She thrust her tablet in front of him, showing a social media post from a rural animal rescue group outside Portland. They just posted about a remarkable rescue. The post described a recent discovery, a colony of stray cats living in an abandoned barn about 30 miles north of Portland. What caught John's attention was the mention of an unusual member among the group, an orange tabby that seemed different from the others, better groomed despite its current condition, suggesting it had once been someone's pet. "It might not be him," Linda said gently, seeing the hope flash across John's face. "But we're going to help with the rescue operation tomorrow. Would you like to come along?" That night, John barely slept. He knew the odds were astronomical. Milo had disappeared in Connecticut, and this was Maine. The distance alone made it seem impossible. Yet something about the description nagged at him, refusing to let go of the tiny spark of hope that had ignited in his heart. The next morning dawned bitter cold. John joined Linda and two other volunteers in the shelter's van, equipment rattling in the back as they made their way north. The landscape grew increasingly rural, trees heavy with snow replacing buildings and streets. The barn, when they finally reached it, looked like something from a winter postcard, weathered with dusted with white, icicles hanging from the eaves. "Remember," Linda cautioned as they prepared their equipment, "these cats are likely to be very wary of humans. We need to be patient and careful." She didn't need to remind John. Patience had become his specialty over the past months. The rescue operation proceeded slowly. The local group had already set up feeding stations and tracking systems, making it easier to locate the cats. One by one, they carefully trapped and transferred the animals to carriers, documenting each rescue. John's heart jumped every time they spotted an orange cat, but none of them was Milo. As the afternoon wore on, hope began to fade. They had successfully rescued most of the colony, but the mysterious orange tabby remained elusive. The local rescuers mentioned they usually saw it around sunset when it would come to eat. "We can wait a little longer," Linda offered, seeing the determination in John's eyes. The other volunteers had already started loading the van with their rescues, but John couldn't bear to leave, not yet. He stayed near one of the feeding stations, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. The sun was setting when he heard it, a familiar sound that made his heart stop. From behind a stack of old hay bales came a meow he would have recognized anywhere. But it wasn't just any meow. It was the specific trill Milo used to make when he wanted attention, a sound as unique as a fingerprint. John forced himself to remain still, hardly daring to breathe. The light was fading fast, casting long shadows across the snow-covered ground. Movement caught his eye, a flash of orange fur in the dimness. The cat emerged cautiously from behind the bales, and John felt the world tilt beneath his feet. The animal was thin, its once lustrous fur matted and dull. But those eyes, those golden eyes that had watched him every morning across the breakfast table, were unmistakable. Before he could process what was happening, before he could even call out, the cat stopped in its tracks, nose twitching as it caught his scent on the winter air. What happened next would forever change John's understanding of the bonds between humans and animals and the mysterious ways that love could bridge impossible distances. The universe, it seemed, had one more surprise in store for both man and cat. Time seemed to freeze in that twilight moment at the old barn. The orange cat stood perfectly still, its golden eyes locked with John's. The only sound was the soft whisper of snowflakes falling around them, nature holding its breath for what felt like an eternity. "Milo," John whispered, his voice barely audible. The cat's ears twitched at the sound of its name, and something flickered in those familiar eyes. John's heart thundered in his chest as he slowly, carefully, lowered himself to a crouching position in the snow. Linda, watching from a distance, knew better than to move or speak. In her 20 years of animal rescue, she had witnessed many reunions, but something about this moment felt different. The tension in the air was almost electric. The cat took one hesitant step forward, then another. Its nose worked overtime, sampling the air, processing the scent of the human before it. John remained perfectly still, fighting every instinct that screamed at him to rush forward and scoop up his lost friend. "It's me, buddy," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been looking for you for so long." Something in those words, or perhaps in the familiar tone of John's voice, seemed to break through. The cat's next step was more confident, its tail beginning to rise from its previously defensive position. When it was about 5 feet away, it stopped again, and then it happened, the sound that John had heard in his dreams for months. The distinctive trill, Milo's special greeting, echoed across the snowy barnyard. It was a sound that no other cat made quite the same way, a unique vocal signature that had been part of their daily communication for years. Tears began to freeze on John's cheeks as Milo, because now there was no doubt it was him, began to move forward with purpose. The final steps happened in a rush. Milo closed the distance with sudden determination, launching himself toward John with complete abandon. John caught him instinctively, the way he had done hundreds of times before in their life together. The cat pressed his head under John's chin, purring so loudly it seemed to vibrate through both their bodies. "Oh God, Milo," John choked out, holding his friend close. How is this possible?" The cat's only response was to purr louder, his paws kneading John's jacket just as they used to knead his chest during their quiet evenings at home. Linda approached slowly, wiping tears from her own eyes. "I've never seen anything like this," she said softly. "The distance he must have traveled, it's incredible." She reached out to gently examine Milo, her experienced eyes checking for signs of injury or illness. Despite his matted fur and obvious weight loss, Milo appeared remarkably healthy for a cat who had somehow made his way from Connecticut to Maine. His paw pads were worn but healed, suggesting his journey hadn't been recent. He had survived, adapted, and somehow found his way to a place where John would find him. The local rescue volunteers gathered around, drawn by the emotional scene unfolding before them. They shared amazed looks as John explained the story. The flood in Winstead, the desperate separation, the months of searching, and finally, this impossible reunion in a snowy barn in rural Maine. "Animals possess abilities we don't fully understand," one of the older volunteers mused. "Their capacity to find their way home, their ability to maintain bonds across time and distance. It's beyond our comprehension sometimes." As the group began packing up their equipment, Milo refused to leave John's arms. When they tried to put him in a carrier for the drive back to Portland, he complained loudly until John relented and held him on his lap instead. Throughout the journey, Milo maintained physical contact with John, as if afraid they might be separated again. The other rescued cats mewed softly from their carriers in the back of the van, but Milo remained focused solely on John. His purring never ceased, creating a soothing soundtrack for their drive through the winter night. Every few minutes, he would look up at John's face and trill softly, as if reassuring himself that this was real, that they were truly together again. What no one in the van could have known was that this miracle in the snow was just the beginning. The story of John and Milo's reunion would ripple out into the world in ways none of them could have predicted, touching lives far beyond the walls of Portland Animal Haven and proving that some bonds transcend all logical explanation. The news of Milo's miraculous journey spread through Portland Animal Haven like wildfire. By the time John brought him in for a proper veterinary checkup the next morning, the shelter's waiting room was filled with volunteers who had come in on their day off just to witness this extraordinary reunion for themselves. Dr. Rodriguez, the shelter's veteran veterinarian, examined Milo with careful attention while John hovered nearby, unwilling to break physical contact with his friend for more than a few seconds. The cat remained surprisingly calm during the examination, his golden eyes fixed on John as if to say, "It's okay. I'm not going anywhere this time." "Well," Dr. Rodriguez announced, removing her stethoscope, "considering the incredible journey he must have made, Milo is in remarkably good condition. He's dehydrated and underweight, but there are no serious health issues. He's clearly been finding food and shelter along the way and avoiding significant dangers. It's nothing short of miraculous. Linda, who had been documenting everything since the barn rescue, couldn't contain her amazement. "We need to share this story, John," she said, showing him the photos she'd taken of their reunion. "People need to hear about this. It could help so many others who've lost their pets to keep hoping." Initially hesitant about publicity, John found himself reconsidering as he watched Milo interact with some of the shelter's more traumatized residents. The orange tabby seemed to have a calming effect on the other animals, particularly those who had recently arrived at the shelter. Shadow, the black cat who had been so fearful, actually emerged from his corner when Milo approached his cage. "It's like he understands them," one of the younger volunteers observed. "Like he's telling them, 'I made it back, and you can find your way too.'" The local media picked up the story first. A reporter from the Portland Press-Herald came to interview John and photograph Milo, who had quickly made himself at home in the shelter's office. The article, titled "An Impossible Journey Home," captured readers' hearts immediately. Soon, larger news outlets began calling. The story of a cat who had traversed hundreds of miles to reunite with his owner resonated with people far beyond Maine's borders. Social media exploded with shares and comments, many from people sharing their own stories of lost pets and miraculous reunions. But the most profound impact was happening right there at Portland Animal Haven. Families who read about Milo began visiting the shelter in greater numbers, often asking to see the cats who had been there the longest, the ones who needed the most help. Shadow, who had been considered virtually unadoptable, caught the eye of a gentle retired teacher who had recently lost her husband. "If Milo could find his way back across states," she said, sitting patiently near Shadow's cage, "maybe this little one can find his way back to trust." John watched these transformations with a full heart. During the day, he continued his remote work for Millbridge Financial, but his evenings were now split between caring for Milo at home and volunteering at the shelter. His apartment, once a symbol of displacement and loss, had become a warm haven for both of them. Milo, for his part, seemed to understand his role in this larger story. He would sit regally on the shelter's front desk, greeting visitors with the same trill that had confirmed his identity in the barn. Children especially were drawn to him, and he showed infinite patience as little hands gently stroked his now glossy fur. Linda worked with rescue organizations to create a map of possible routes Milo might have taken, using reported sightings of orange cats over the past months. The resulting diagram showed an almost impossible journey through forests and suburbs, across highways and rivers. How had he navigated it all? How had he known which direction would lead him to John? "Some things," Linda said, watching Milo comfort a newly arrived kitten, "aren't meant to be explained. They're meant to be believed in, to give us hope when logic tells us to give up." As winter settled fully over Portland, John began receiving letters and emails from people around the country who had been touched by Milo's story. Many shared their own tales of loss and hope, of waiting and searching, of never giving up. Each night, as Milo reclaimed his spot on John's lap, they read these messages together. Two friends reunited against impossible odds, now helping others believe in miracles. What they didn't know was that their story was about to inspire an even greater change, one that would transform not just individual lives, but the entire way communities thought about lost pets and the bonds between humans and animals. January brought more than just fresh snow to Portland. The story of Milo's incredible journey had sparked something in the community, a movement that began small but grew with the momentum of an avalanche. It started with a simple question from one of the shelter's regular donors. "How many other Milos are out there, trying to find their way home?" The question haunted John. During his lunch breaks at work, he began researching pet recovery systems across the country. His background in accounting proved unexpectedly valuable as he analyzed the statistics of lost pets and successful reunions. The numbers told a story of disconnected efforts and missed opportunities. "Look at this," he showed Linda one evening, spreading out his findings across the shelter's office desk while Milo supervised from his favorite perch. "There's no standardized system connecting different cities' animal services. If a pet crosses city or state lines like Milo did, the chances of reconnection drop dramatically." Linda studied the data, her expression thoughtful. "You know, we've got something special here, John. Your story with Milo. It's opened doors. People are listening now who wouldn't have given us the time of day before." She was right. The shelter's phone had been ringing constantly with calls from other rescue organizations, veterinary clinics, and animal welfare groups across New England. Everyone wanted to know more about the cat, who had traversed states to find his person. John found himself speaking at local community meetings, sharing not just Milo's story, but his vision for a better system. His quiet charm and analytical mind made a compelling combination. When he talked about the need for a unified database and standardized protocols, people listened. "Imagine," he said at one particularly crucial meeting with city officials, "if every shelter, vet clinic, and animal control office in New England was connected. If every found pet's description and location was immediately available to everyone in the network." Milo, who had become something of a mascot, sat regally beside him, adding gravitas to the presentation. The proposal gained traction quickly. Local tech companies, moved by Milo's story, offered to help develop the necessary software. Veterinary clinics agreed to participate in a pilot program. Other shelters began reaching out, eager to be part of what the media was calling the Milo Project. But it wasn't just about systems and databases. The shelter itself was transforming. Linda noticed a change in how people approach adoptions. "They're not just looking for the prettiest or youngest animals anymore," she told John. "They're asking about the ones with stories, the ones who need extra patience and understanding." Shadow, the black cat who had been so profoundly affected by Milo's presence, became something of a spokesperson for these changes. His gradual journey from fearful refugee to confident companion, documented on the shelter's social media, inspired others to give chances to animals they might have overlooked before. The retired teacher who had adopted Shadow started a program bringing senior citizens to spend time with the shelter's more traumatized residents. "Every animal has a story," she would say, "and sometimes they just need someone to listen long enough to hear it." John watched these developments with a mixture of amazement and humility. During quiet moments at home, with Milo purring in his lap, he would reflect on the strange path that had led them here. The flood that had separated them, which had seemed like the end of their story, had somehow become a beginning instead. Millbridge Financial, impressed by John's initiative and the positive publicity, offered to support the Milo project financially. Mr. Patterson, calling from the recovering town of Winstead, proudly announced that they would be one of the first locations to implement the new system. "You and that cat of yours," he chuckled over the phone. "You've started something bigger than yourself, John. People need stories like yours. They need to believe in impossible things sometimes." As winter began to soften toward spring, the changes continued to ripple outward. Other cities began requesting information about implementing similar programs. Animal welfare organizations reached out to study the Portland model. What had started as one cat's incredible journey was becoming a movement. But perhaps the most profound changes were the quiet ones, happening every day at Portland Animal Haven. In the gentle way volunteers sat with frightened animals, in the patience shown to those who needed extra time to trust, in the celebration of each small victory, Milo's spirit of determination and love had become part of the shelter's DNA. What no one realized yet was that the biggest challenge to this newfound hope was just around the corner, and it would test everything they had built in ways they never expected. Spring arrived in Portland with unexpected force, bringing with it the heaviest rains the city had seen in decades. As water levels rose along the coast, John found himself fighting an increasing sense of anxiety. The memories of that terrible night in Winstead were still raw, and Milo seemed to sense his unease, staying closer than usual, offering comfort with gentle headbutts and constant purring. The Milo project had been running successfully for 3 months, connecting shelters across New England and already facilitating dozens of reunions between lost pets and their families. But nature, it seemed, had decided to test their newfound systems in ways no one had anticipated. "We're getting reports of flooding in coastal areas," Linda announced during an emergency staff meeting at Portland Animal Haven. The city's emergency services are predicting possible evacuations in low-lying areas. "We need to be ready." John felt his chest tighten at those words. Beside him, Milo sat alert, his tail twitching as if he too remembered the chaos of water and wind. But this time was different. This time they were prepared, and they had a network of support behind them. The shelter's phone began ringing constantly with calls from worried pet owners in the flood risk zones. Many remembered Milo's story and were terrified of facing similar separations. John found himself becoming the voice of reassurance, sharing practical advice born from his own experience. Get your pets' carriers ready now, he advised during a hastily organized community meeting. Take current photos, make sure their microchip information is updated in our database. Don't wait until the evacuation orders come. Milo, as always, sat regally beside him, living proof that even the worst situations could have positive outcomes. The shelter transformed into an emergency response center. Volunteers worked tirelessly to prepare extra space for animals that might need temporary housing. The Milo Project's database became a crucial tool, allowing real-time tracking of pets arriving at various shelters across the region. As the rains intensified, the first evacuees began arriving with their animals. John watched as families came in, clutching carriers and leashes, their faces showing the same fear he had felt that night in Winstead. But unlike his experience, they had somewhere to go, someone to help, a system designed to keep them connected to their beloved pets. Shadow's adopter, the retired teacher, opened her large home as a temporary shelter for cats from the most threatened areas. Milo showed us that miracles are possible, she said, helping to set up emergency accommodations in her sunroom. But it's better if we can prevent the need for miracles in the first place. The true test came when the storm hit its peak. Power flickered across the city, and the emergency sirens began their ominous wail. The shelter's generator hummed to life, keeping their essential systems running. John and several other volunteers stayed overnight, monitoring the animals and updating their database as new arrivals came in. During a particularly intense moment, as thunder shook the building, John found Milo sitting with a group of frightened cats who had just arrived. The orange tabby's calm presence seemed to soothe them, and John watched in amazement as his friend demonstrated a level of empathy that seemed almost human. He knows, Lindo observed softly. He remembers what it's like to be scared and displaced, but he also knows there's hope. She paused, watching as Milo gently groomed a trembling kitten. That's the real miracle of your story, John. Not just the reunion, but what it's taught all of us about resilience and compassion. As the night wore on, the shelter systems proved their worth. Every animal was accounted for, every family knew where their pets were, and the network of connected shelters worked seamlessly to coordinate resources and information. The database John had helped design handled the strain perfectly, proving that preparation and organization could make a crucial difference in times of crisis. What they didn't realize was that this storm was just the beginning. Nature had one more challenge in store, one that would put everything they had built to the ultimate test and force them to redefine their understanding of what was possible when a community came together with a common purpose. The storm's intensity grew beyond anyone's expectations. Portland hadn't seen such severe weather since the great storms of the previous century. As the rain continued to pound the city, the emergency services announced an expanded evacuation zone that would affect thousands of residents and their pets. John stood at the shelter's command center, now a hub of intense activity, watching as the digital map lit up with new entries. The Milo Project's database was handling hundreds of updates per hour, tracking pets and their families across the region. Each ping represented a story, a bond, a family fighting to stay together despite nature's fury. "We're at capacity," Linda announced, her usually calm voice tight with concern. "Every shelter in Portland is full, and we're still getting calls." She looked at the rain-streaked windows, where the storm showed no signs of abating. "We need to think bigger." That's when John had an idea. He remembered how the community had come together after his story with Milo went public. What if we activate our entire network? Not just the shelters, but everyone who's ever been touched by Milo's story. Within hours, social media channels exploded with a new hashtag Milo's Mission. People began offering their homes, garages, and basements as temporary shelters. Local businesses transformed their spaces into pet-friendly evacuation centers. The database expanded to include these impromptu shelters, creating a vast network of safe havens. Shadow's former neighbor at the shelter, a large Maine Coon named Perseus, had recently been adopted by a local tech entrepreneur. Now, his new owner opened his company's entire warehouse as an emergency pet shelter, complete with climate control and security systems. Milo's story showed us that every pet deserves a chance, he said as volunteers helped set up temporary kennels. The retired teacher who had adopted Shadow coordinated a network of senior citizens who offered to pet sit in their homes. "We may be old," she declared, "but we know something about weathering storms, and we have love to give." Milo, ever the shelter's ambassador, seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. He moved among the frightened animals with purposeful grace, his presence bringing calm to chaos. New arrivals would watch him, this legendary cat who had crossed states to find his person, and something in their posture would relax, as if his very existence offered hope. The most remarkable transformation happened at midnight, during the storm's peak. A family arrived with their elderly golden retriever, soaked and shaking. All the dog spaces were full, and the family was desperate. Before anyone could respond, 3 separate families who had taken shelter with their cats offered to share their space. "We're all in this together," one of them said, making room in their temporary enclosure. That's what Milo's story taught us, isn't it? Love doesn't care about boundaries or species. It just finds a way. John watched this scene unfold, his heart full. Beside him, Milo sat tall, surveying his domain with those wise golden eyes. The cat had become more than just a miracle. He had become a symbol of what was possible when hope and determination met community support. The shelter's computer systems hummed with activity as the database continued to track every animal, every family, every safe haven. The network they had built proved stronger than the storm itself. Not a single pet was lost or unaccounted for. Not a single family was turned away without help. In the early hours of the morning, as the storm began to show signs of weakening, John received an unexpected call. It was Mr. Patterson from Winstead calling to say that they had activated their part of the network to help communities in Connecticut facing similar challenges. "Your story with Milo," Mr. Patterson said, his voice thick with emotion, "it didn't just create a database or a system. It created a movement. It showed people that when we come together, miracles don't have to be rare. We can make them happen." As dawn approached, bringing with it the first hints of clearing skies, John realized that something profound had shifted in the world. The nightmare that had separated him from Milo had been transformed into a force for unity and hope. But even as the immediate crisis began to ease, fate had one more surprise in store. A final test that would prove just how far the ripples of one cat's journey could reach. 1 year after the remarkable reunion in the snowy barn, John stood at the podium of Portland City Hall, Milo perched regally beside him. The occasion was the official launch of the National Pet Recovery Network, an expansion of the Milo project that would connect shelters and pet owners across the entire country. "A year ago," John began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "I was just an accountant who had lost his best friend. Today, we stand here because one cat's incredible journey showed us what's possible when love meets determination, when individual hope meets community support." The audience was filled with faces both familiar and new. Linda sat in the front row, beside Shadow's owner and dozens of other people who had been part of their story. Representatives from animal shelters across the country had come to witness this moment, each carrying their own tales of lost pets and miraculous reunions inspired by Milo's story. During last month's storms, John continued, our network helped reunite over 300 families with their pets. Not a single animal in our connected shelters was left unaccounted for. But more importantly, we discovered something profound, that the bonds between humans and animals have the power to transform entire communities. Milo, as if understanding the significance of the moment, stood and stretched, drawing fond chuckles from the audience. His coat gleamed under the lights, a far cry from the matted fur of his wandering days. Yet his eyes remained the same, wise, gentle, and somehow knowing. The new national database was unveiled on large screens behind them, a sophisticated system that had grown from John's simple spreadsheets into a comprehensive network connecting shelters, veterinarians, and pet owners across America. But it was more than just technology. It was a testament to the power of one story to change countless lives. "We've learned that miracles don't have to be rare," John said, reaching down to scratch Milo's ears. "Sometimes they just need a little help, a community willing to believe, to support, to come together when it matters most." As if on cue, the doors at the back of the hall opened and a procession began. Led by Shadow and his owner, dozens of people entered with their pets, each one a success story from the past year. There was Perseus and his tech entrepreneur owner, who had turned their warehouse experience into a model for corporate-sponsored pet emergency shelters. There were the senior citizens who had formed a national network of pet sitters for emergencies. But most moving were the reunited families, people and pets who had found each other again thanks to the systems and community that had grown from Milo's story. Each pair represented a thread in the larger tapestry of hope and connection that had been woven over the past year. What started with one lost cat has become something greater than any of us imagined, Linda added, joining John at the podium. The Milo Project isn't just about finding lost pets anymore. It's about finding the best in ourselves, about recognizing that every animal's life has value, and every bond between human and pet is worth fighting for. As the ceremony concluded, John returned to his seat with Milo in his arms. The cat purred contentedly, seemingly at peace with his role as the catalyst for such profound change. Outside, the spring sun shone brightly over Portland, and somewhere in the distance, church bells rang, their sound carrying across the city that had become home to this remarkable story of love, loss, and redemption. That evening, as John and Milo sat in their favorite spot by the window overlooking the harbor, he reflected on the journey that had brought them here. The fear and pain of their separation had been transformed into hope for countless others. Their story had shown that sometimes the greatest miracles come not from the extraordinary events themselves, but from how they inspire ordinary people to do extraordinary things. Milo trilled softly and pressed his head against John's hand, his familiar gesture of affection unchanged by fame or circumstance. In that quiet moment, John understood that while their story had touched thousands of lives, the greatest miracle remained the simple, unbreakable bond between a man and his cat, a bond strong enough to find its way home across hundreds of miles, and in doing so, help others find their way too. Dear listeners, we hope that John and Milo's extraordinary journey has touched your hearts. This story of love, perseverance, and hope shows us that the deepest bonds can overcome any obstacle. For more inspiring stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give this video a like. Share your own stories of love and resilience with your pets in the comments below. Together, we'll continue believing in miracles and the transformative power of love. See you next time.